Okay, so here is your first paper assignment. The length is going to be 1,000 words, maximum 1,300 words. If you give me more than 1,300, I'm going to send it back to you and say cut some. And if it's less than 1,000, there's going to be a penalty. Obviously, the farther you fall short of 1,000, the greater the penalty will be. But that comes out to about 3 to 4 pages. Type doublespace, and please submit it to me as 12-point Times New Roman. Check Canvas to find out when the due dates are. There will be a due date for your thesis and 3 to 4 topic sentences, and there is also a due date for the final draft. Obviously, Canvas will tell you what those dates are for you. In class, we have said that every dramatic text involves conflict of some sort. In longer works, such as novels or movies, the central conflict is usually pretty clear. Our hero must convince his fiance's father that he's a worthy suitor, or a lawyer must overcome the odds to prove her client is innocent. In longer works, there are also likely to be subplots, each with its own conflicts. But in shorter works, and that's what we're reading, right? Short stories, there's likely a single plot line whose point may not be entirely clear. Likewise, the central conflict is often subtle, must be teased out of the events of the story, and is subject to debate. You and I may not agree on what the central conflict is, which is good, because that's what makes it, when you announce what the central conflict is, that's what makes it a thesis. For this paper, choose one of the short stories assigned for this class. Either we've read it already or haven't read it yet, and identify and analyze the central conflict. So that is, your paper will argue that the conflict you have identified is indeed the central conflict, and you will likely do so by analyzing its importance to the story. Maybe it's its centrality to some larger theme, or its centrality to some larger message, okay? So this is not a thematic paper. Instead, you are going to say the central conflict in Chitra Divakaruni's Mrs. Dutta Writes a Letter is between, and then you're going to need an A and a B, okay? It's not enough to say that the central conflict is Mrs. Dutta's inner conflict, okay? You're going to need to tell me, well, what is the nature of that inner conflict? Remember that in inner conflict, and maybe your story isn't an inner conflict, maybe it's a person-by-person conflict, okay? One person against another person. But an inner conflict is, you need to name what that is. You invite me to your party, and I want to go, but maybe there's somebody there I don't want to see. So I am conflicted between my desire to go and my fear of going, of something bad that might happen. I'm going to see somebody I don't want to see. Okay, so that's an inner conflict. That's the A versus B. Okay, so you need to spell out what is the A versus B. Maybe the central conflict in Alice Walker's everyday use is between the mama's desire to have to be appreciated by Dee, and the impossibility of that happening because of Dee's inherent character traits, something like that. Okay, or her personality, or because of her false understanding of what heritage is, something like that. Okay, so think about that. What is this? And then name it the central conflict. Once you've named it the central conflict, you have a thesis, because it's now arguable, because somebody could argue against it. Somebody could say, no, that's not the central conflict, something else is. Okay, some hints, not necessarily in order, and again, the goal, these are just sort of thinking points, okay? But some hints to be thinking about. Ask yourself, who is the main character, okay? We want to figure that out. Usually it's the person we hear most about, but it's also the person who seems to be having the conflict. It's also the person around whom the climax is surrounding, okay? So who's the main character? We call that person the protagonist. And what is his or her aim or goal? What is it that that person wants, okay? And who or what is keeping him or her from attaining it? So we call that the antagonist. But the antagonist doesn't have to be a person. The antagonist, even more often than not, is just circumstances, okay? So Mrs. Dutta's main goal in life is to be useful, to have a useful, purposeful role in her family. And the antagonist is the circumstances, right? It's just, that's not going to happen amongst her Americanized family. It's not what they want, okay? So it's just not going to happen in Sunnyvale. In what ways, ideas, not just events, in what ways does the conflict make itself known? For example, you haven't read this story yet, but for example, Moretta's budding femininity is an idea for which you want to find instances, preferably more than one. Okay, so think in terms of ideas, not particular events, but ideas that those represent. I'll say more about that in a moment. What do you identify as the climax of the story? This is likely the moment when the central conflict reaches its most crucial moment, what James Joyce calls the epiphany. Okay. Now, not all climaxes come in the form of an epiphany. Okay. But many do, and the ones that we read for today do, don't they? They each have an epiphany, and I would call that the climax. In each case, we have the protagonist recognizing, having this immediate epiphany, this immediate insight, and changing as a result. If the climax you identify has little to do with what you take to be the central conflict, you probably are wrong about one or both. Meaning, if you say, well, here's the climax, but then you can't say, well, how was that climax? How does that bring to the central conflict, this most crucial moment? If you can't, then you're probably wrong about one or both. And you'll notice that in all these stories, which is very typical in short stories, the climax comes very near the end. You can't have a climax on page 2 of a 10-page short story. Okay? And then finally, this might help too. What is the resolution? This is the moment when the central conflict is likely solved, or perhaps we have a better understanding of the place the conflict will continue to have in the characters' future lives. And I said the resolution in everyday use, to me, it's when Maggie and Mama are sitting out there and we see, okay, well, this is going to be their lives and they're going to enjoy each other's company. Okay. Very end of the story. Okay. Before submitting your final draft, I'm always going to have a list of things just to be thinking about. There's also going to be a separate checklist that you should take a look at before you get too deep into the revision process of your essay. Okay, but we'll have more to say about that later. But just some things to be thinking about even as you are just starting out on this essay. Your paper must have an introduction that includes a clear thesis stated early. Okay, now, you might want to take some notes on this too. There is no law that says it has to be the last sentence of the first paragraph, the introductory paragraph, but that seems to be a good place to put it, okay? That's a good habit to have, to make it the last sentence of the intro. Think of the introduction as you are grabbing the reader's hand and leading the reader through the introduction so that when you hit them with the thesis is the central conflict of this short story is between A and B, okay? Then nothing about that is particularly surprising. You kind of led the reader, you prepared the reader for it. Maybe you start with something very general. Often we believe that our happiness lies in our being with family. Okay, something very general, and then you tighten it until, well, that's not always the case, and then somehow we get to Mrs. Dutt as a thesis, right? Number 2, super important. That's why I underlined it and put it in bold letters. Do not retell events in the story. Assume your reader is very familiar with the story you choose. Okay, so, and your reader, meaning I'm very familiar with these stories. So any space you give retelling the story is wasted space. It's space you're not arguing. Okay, now, you will, however, note certain moments in the text that help prove you have properly identified the central conflict. Okay, you're going to point out a particular moment in the text. When Mama grabs the quilts from Dee and gives it to Maggie, this shows that. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You're telling me what particular moment is important for the point you're trying to make at that spot. Okay, but if you find yourself writing and then, you are on the wrong track. If you tell me in 2 or 3 sentences, it is just describing events happening in the story without analysis, you're going about it the wrong way. Number 3 is also very important. Your argument should be point-driven, not event-driven. Okay, so you're not retelling the story as a series of events. You will bring in events. You will mention events, okay? But you're going to mention events to prove a point. So don't mention an event in your topic sentence. We'll learn more about topic sentences next week. But rather focus on the point you want the event to demonstrate. So the conflict is intensified when Mrs. Dutt wants to greet her new neighbors. That's not a good topic sentence, okay? Because her wanting to meet her new neighbors is an event. So that's event-driven, less effective than Mrs. Dutt's stubborn adherence to her cultural certainties further intensifies her inner conflict. Okay, so this is not event-driven. It's an idea that she has this stubborn adherence. She holds on stubbornly to her cultural certainty. But can I put certainties in quotation marks? That's a word that Devaka-Rooney uses, isn't it? Late in the short story. So the first one might be good evidence. Okay, so of the second one. So maybe to prove that she stubbornly adheres to her cultural certainties, maybe as evidence of that, you can explain how she wants to greet her new neighbors. Okay, that's evidence. So we don't want to put evidence in our topic sentence. Okay, we want our topic sentence to be about an idea. That part of Mrs. Dutta's problem is she's stubborn. Okay, that's an idea. Then you're going to bring in events in the text, not retelling events in the text, but you're going to mention events in the text as evidence that, yes, she is stubborn, holding on to her cultural certainties. Okay. Your paper must have an original creative title that includes the author's name, the title of the short story. Don't call your essay Everyday Use. The title's already taken by Alice Walker. And don't call it Everyday Use Paper. That's not really original. Instead, think of a title that hints at what your paper will be about, such as Misunderstanding One's Heritage in, and then you mention the author, Alice Walker's, and then you mention the short story title in quotation marks, everyday use. Okay? Use first person I, me, my sparingly, if at all. You don't need to say in my opinion, or I think, or to me this sounds like. The whole thing is your opinion. Okay? And so don't use I, me, my. The only reason to ever use I, me, my is if somehow, maybe in your introduction or your conclusion, you you want to, you have a personal anecdote that somehow you could bring in that's going to give some insight. Okay, possibly. But not in the middle of your paper saying, to me, this sounds like, okay? You don't need that. Everything in your paper is your opinion, okay? When writing about events in a work of fiction, use present tense throughout, okay? So none of this ever happened in actual, world history, okay? So instead, it happens in the present. Whenever anybody's reading it, these things are happening. These things are unfolding. Okay, on the surface of that person's brain. So it's Dee visits her family, talks to her mother, grabs the quilts. It's not visited, talked, or grabbed. It's not past tense. Okay, even when you're talking about events late in the story and you refer back to something earlier in the story, it's still present tense. Okay, italicize or underline titles of long works. So we don't have any long works here. There's no novels. There's no long plays here. There's no textbooks here. So it's short stories. We use quotation marks around titles of short works. So it's really going to be quotation marks anytime you mention the name of your short story, including in your title. Okay? Do not italicize, underline, or use quotation marks for your own title. Okay? Your own title should not be bold, should not be big, should not be underlined, should not be italicized, should not be put in quotation marks. Okay? Your own title should look like all the rest of the font that you're using throughout the rest of your essay, with the exception that you'll put quotation marks around the title of the short story. Make sure you proofread. The occasional typo is acceptable. God knows I am guilty of typos. But if you have too many of them, you might be suggesting to your reader you just don't care about what grade you get. Okay? Respect yourself. And when you respect yourself, you respect your reader a lot more. Give your reader what you take to be, this is the very best I've got right now. Okay? And so that means that when you're writing down the names of the authors, don't use lowercase letters for the beginnings of their names. Or if you're referring to a character, let's say it's D, don't spell it with a lowercase d. Those sort of simple, really easy to fix sort of things. When those show up, when you give your professor too many of those, that's not sending a very good message, okay? And then finally, use MLA format as described in Bedford. I have a link on the syllabus to a Bedford handbook, and in it has all kinds of grammar information and also how to do MLA format. But there are other places on the internet where you can find, okay, what should MLA format look like? Where does your name go? Where does my name go? How do you number the pages? That sort of thing, okay? Now, because we're working on short stories that just came in PDF files, I don't expect a works cited page, okay? Because, I'm not telling you precisely, all the publishing information where these stories are coming from, so I can't expect you to somehow find out. But I do want you to use in-text citation. So if you quote from a particular, from a short story, make sure that you say what page numbers that came from, okay? All right. You know what? I feel like I skipped part of number one, so I'm going to go back to number one really quickly here. Your paper must have an introduction that includes a clear thesis stated early. We said that already. Each body paragraph must have a topic sentence. I prefer that you start each body paragraph with a topic sentence. We'll have more to say about thesis and topic sentence next week. And you must have a conclusion. Let me tell you, and again, take notes on this. Here are two things a conclusion should not do. Don't summarize what you've already said. Okay, it's a very short paper. It's 1,000 to 1,300 words. You don't need to summarize what you've already said. Okay, and don't keep arguing. In other words, you aren't still trying to convince me that you have found the central conclusion. So instead, answer a so what question. Okay, what maybe is there a larger take-home message that the story is trying to teach us? You know, and if so, it's likely through the central conflict that there's some sort of a message the story is trying to teach us. Through its conflict of A versus B, Mrs. Dutta writes a letter, shows us that. Okay. And then some sort of, what's the take-home message? Something like that. Okay. All right. Take care. See you guys next time. Bye.